Okay, it's recording now. Today we're going to be having a discussion on the synoptic problem. And these two gentlemen I have today, Dr. Dennis MacDonald, Dr. Markus Vinzent, have very different views on how to solve the synoptic problem. Dennis MacDonald goes with the Q plus Papias hypothesis, as he calls it, while Markus Vinzent thinks that Marcion's Gospel is basically the first gospel, and the four gospels were aware of his text, and that this is all going down in the 130s CE in the 2nd century. So that being said, Dr. Vinzent, would you like to go first and discuss your views on the synoptic problem?
So thanks very much for inviting both of us here to discuss with you and with each other this type of a question. And I think to locate my position in the development of that problem is, if I may start from the backside, that after 150, almost 200 years, we are doing the show which we do today, and have the discussion that we have today indicates that there is a synoptic problem which somehow colleagues, with all the endeavors and all the books they've written and all the articles that are being published, still couldn't solve. So there is a case for Dennis's suggestion, for my suggestion, for anybody else's suggestion, because the best experts in the field, the great minds of the 19th century, even of the 18th century and earlier, Augustine struggled with the problem of the synoptics. Irenaeus, as we know, is the first to make a synoptic comparison. I will come back to that in a second. And until today, we have not solved the synoptic problem. Interestingly, in the past 200 years particularly, we have, let's say, a major strand of scholars that have settled with what we call the two sources hypothesis. So the basic idea of this majority strand of colleagues, and that's what you will find in most textbooks. That's what I've learned at school. That's what my students learn at my faculty. And that's what we have in the catechisms and wherever. In the meantime, even of more conservative denominations, is that the oldest text that brings together the teachings of Christ is in effect not one of our canonical gospels. It is in fact a source which carries a German name, not because I'm German, but it simply is because it was earliest in the 19th century called the Quelle, which means the source. So in Britain one would, or in England and America, one would probably speak about S instead of Q for source. So that's the oldest text. And I've learned from my friend and colleague John Kloppenburg, who also was here on the show with Jacob a few times, that it was developed as a major breakthrough, also in conversations with more traditional views of the New Testament, that the first source that we can handle and have, that's the oldest source we could get a grip on, is not one of the divinely inspired canonical writings, but is predating those, being even the basis for divine scripture, which gives us a total new question, of course. What is with divine inspiration? Has this older source been divinely inspired? Is it an uninspired text collection, which then became only reformulated in the inspired canonical texts? So the whole question of divine inspiration, I think, is a theological problem which is connected with the synoptic problem. And that's why I do understand that people from different fields and backgrounds and beliefs not only struggle with the problem we're struggling with, namely how to solve the synoptic problem, but there is an underlying intense theological reflection which is connected with the question of how to solve this problem. And in a sense, if you like, neither Dennis nor myself, but Dennis will speak for himself, neither one of us, I think, will solve the problem of divine inspiration, because we are thinking, and I'm thinking, that something like the source of Q is underlying the canonical Gospels. The question is how to define that substructure. And actually, I'm not a New Testament scholar. I have worked my life in patristics and medieval theology and religious history. I came only to the field that I tried to avoid most of my life. Not because I tried to avoid the canonical texts, which I always liked and studied. However, I tried to avoid the piles of books people like Dennis and others have written, which I'm afraid I was so scared of, as most people will be when they see the intricate discussions, the minute attempts to resolve the parallelism and the discrepancies between these texts. Now, this brings me to the major problem we have, and this is, I think, it is unparalleled in antiquity, and something which is unparalleled always is a problem. So we have, in effect, 4 today known canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of which the first 3 are more similar than John is to, and with respect to the first 3. Having said that, nevertheless, they share so much that these canonical texts are part of a collection, and people struggled all the way through how and why we have 4 accounts of the same story instead of just 1. And the question also was, and is, did we have 4 of these stories which have grown in parallel and then were collected in an entity, or how are they related to each other? Now, the first 3 are so parallel. I mean, in phrases, chapters, literally, partly at least, identical, that we can put them in what we call a synopsis. So Greek or Latin or translated synopsis, so that we can have row by row the text and can see the minute differences that exist between, let's say, a story that we know from Matthew, we find also in Mark. Sometimes we find them twice in Matthew and only once in Mark. And we have this story again in Luke. And some of these stories we also find in John. Now, when we say the stories, it's not just that some people knew the story. They must have seen, not just heard the story, because these texts are literally so identical that you can only have that kind of identity, particularly with the differences that exist, if people were working from what we could call a manuscript. Now, they didn't have desks, yeah, but they worked on their laps, yeah, and they must have had codices in front of them when they were working on their own text, which aggravates the situation historically. I mean, how can people around the Mediterranean have these texts in front of them? And this is where I, as a historian, started to stumble over the solutions that have been proposed, because today, we believe, according to our textbooks, irrespective of whether we go for this 2 sources hypothesis, which is Q as the earliest one, and then the oldest gospel people believe was Mark, this majority of people believe. So if Q had been produced somewhere, and I haven't seen a harmonious view of scholars where it's been produced, but there are more people to subscribe to the idea that Mark was then the first canonical gospel that picked up ideas from Q or similar to Q, and that this person, whose name we don't know, but who was given as Mark, a student Paul, that he has written his text in or around the years 70. Some believe earlier than 70, some slightly after the year 70, and 70 because of the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem.
Yep.
Now, the second gospel is supposed to have been written some years later, which is Matthew. And people believe, who think of these two sources, Mark and Q, that Matthew had picked up these two sources and produced his own gospel. Mark, because of some Latinisms and a few other elements, people believe was written close or even in the city of Rome. Matthew, already are the opinions pretty divided where the gospel has been produced. Some think of Asia Minor, some think of Ephesus. So let's put Asia Minor in, or Syria, in the frame. The next gospel that has been produced, again, a few years later, people believe, was Luke. And Luke, they think, and here comes Dennis later with his own view, Luke is supposed to have used, just like Matthew, the two sources, Q and Mark. However, he didn't use Matthew. And why? The people who have created the idea of Q and have produced, even in a big critical edition, the text of Q, were only able to do so because you can only extract a text from two parallel texts if these two parallel texts are unrelated. So let's say if I copy Dennis's book, and Jacob's ideas and put them into a new book, one couldn't extract from this kind of meddled text a text that underlies all the other two. But if, for example, I didn't know about Dennis's writings, and we would still have a text that is so identical in Dennis's books and in my books, people would say, oh, they have plagiarized Jacob. They have taken everything from Jacob, and we can even restore Jacob's book out of Dennis's and Marcus's book by just seeing the parallels, the literal parallels of our two works. So they must have copied Jacob, which I think wouldn't be too far-fetched because Jacob has great ideas. So here comes the question. So Q can only be recreated if Luke and Matthew are separate, that they have a separate access to Q and Mark. And you can already see the production of Q relies on a circular argument. Only if Matthew and Luke did not know each other, we have a serious basis for the production of Q and how we can restore it. I don't want to go into John. John is a bit later. Just to finalize this kind of and round it up, if these Gospels had been written between the years, let's say 70 and 100, John, and if these Gospels had been written around the Mediterranean, from Rome to Syria and John, wherever, Gregor of Nyssa tells us that Luke's being produced in Saloniki. So if the Gospels had been produced around the Mediterranean and the Gospel writers needed to work on codices, which they had in front of them, how is it possible, by a span of 30 years and by a span around the Mediterranean, that until about 140 AD, not a single author of our early Christian literature that we have, authors who widely quote and cite Paul, never ever quote anything from the narratives which we find in one of the four Gospels. The only thing that people outside the Gospel writers know of are some sayings, which starts with Paul's letters. But then most of what we know from sayings, be it in Clement, be it in the Didache, be it in other texts, we do not find in one of the four Gospels, or at least not in the form that we have it in the four Gospels. So what we do find is some sayings which we do not find in the four Gospels, but none of the narratives. No wonder, no birth story, no resurrection story, none of the stories we know from the Gospels we find in any of our patristic literature from the first 150 years. So I couldn't, as an historian, I couldn't overcome the problem of saying, well, how can it be that gospel writers have manuscripts and know these texts and nobody else knows them? How can they work from each other's texts but nobody else? So only gospel writers reproduce and know and read their own stuff. It's making not much sense for an historian. So I started to reverse the idea and thought of maybe the genealogy that we have established in the synoptic problem by saying A is dependent on, or B is dependent on A, C is dependent on B, or D is dependent on A and B, and C and D are not dependent on each other. That's kind of genealogy of a family tree is the biggest problem of the synoptic problem. So it's not the synoptic problem itself, it's the methodology of the synoptic problem which might not be right. And I started to think of the development of these four canonical Gospels rather in terms of a network where the authors of these texts were living rather in a similar place and wrote roughly at the same time. Because that would explain that sometimes John is right with his two sources hypothesis, sometimes Dennis is right, sometimes Mark Goodacre is right, or other colleagues who are of the opinion that Q doesn't exist. Because it depends on which chapter you take and which verses you look at. If texts are interrelated, or as we say in the manuscript tradition, they are cross-contaminated. So by writing the one chapter, I look at what others have done. And others who are writing and rewriting this chapter, they know what I have done, even how I have rewritten my text in light of what the others know. So they know each other's work. And after I had thought about that, I was reading Tertullian again, who is our first commentator of canonical literature that survives, although it's rarely taken into account by any New Testament colleague who writes commentaries on the New Testament texts. But he's the earliest commentator of Paul's letters, and he's the earliest commentator of Luke's Gospel, although not in the version that we have, but in a pre-canonical collection. And this pre-canonical collection has been brought together by Marcion. So you see, I'm coming at the end of my talk to the beginning. But that was the journey. I only came to know Marcion through this journey. And Tertullian tells us that Marcion explains in his preface that the four people we know as two apostles, Matthew and John, and two disciples of apostles, Luke and Mark, that these four were copying their texts as plagiarisms, as he says, of his text. But not of his text which he published. But as Tertullian then laughs about the whole story, because he says Marcion himself admits that he only published his text after the other texts were published already. And I think he was right. Marcion couldn't deny that because he only had published, because in his preface, he refers to these four, of course, which he criticizes as plagiarisms of his own. But that presumes that the plagiarists had already had access to a pre-version of Marcion's text. So that's the story which I try to configure in my book, Marcion and the Dating of the Synoptic Gospels. To say that when Marcion published his text, he knew of the 4 canonical Gospels and may have even rewritten some of his chapters in light of those canonical plagiarisms of his text. But that these 4 canonical Gospels may have gone back to a pre-version which Marcion had produced. And I have colleagues like Matthias Klinghardt, Jason Bedoun, who in principle hold a similar position, only thinking that what I think was produced by Marcion as the version which he himself and Tertullian and everybody in the 2nd century know as Marcion's text. These scholars of the 19th and, well, rather of the 20th, 21st century try to dispute that by saying, oh no, this text is not by Marcion, but is an older text, just like Q. With the only advantage, of course, that this text can be reconstituted out of the commentaries that we have from Tertullian, Epiphanius, and other colleagues from the early church. So, a patristic scholar who was thrown into the wild ocean of New Testament studies. And I hope I didn't drown, but still struggle to swim.
All right, Dr. MacDonald.
Well, I'm not a patristic scholar, although I am going to talk about Papias and get your views on Papias. I like to think of myself as a classicist who does New Testament scholars. And so we're both coming from outside the field and hope to make a contribution to it. Marcus, I agree with much of your assessment of the synoptic problem. And so instead of hitting all of those points again, I just want to hit on a few where I agree with you, and where we can say that the synoptic problem, I mean, I really do think I've solved the synoptic problem, but nobody else seems to think so. So I know the problem isn't solved until we have some more consensus. But in any case, the dominant position of the 2-document hypothesis, or the 2-source hypothesis you mentioned, with John Kloppenborg as one of its champions, is flawed. And it was flawed almost as soon as the International Q Project committed itself to saying that Luke did not know Matthew. I think that the evidence is overwhelming that Luke knew Matthew. Now, the question then is it impossible to reconstruct Q if Luke does know Matthew as well as Mark? Now, again, we're staying with the 2-document hypothesis and have to move beyond it. Another flaw in the traditional version of the 2-document hypothesis, as you know, but you didn't mention, is that Mark knows Q, although you did mention the possibility that Mark knows Q. The overlapping because of Matthean and Lucan doublets and non-doublets is overwhelming. If there were a Q document, then Mark must have known it. Now, you didn't mention the name David Trobisch, but Trobisch and you have similar attitudes toward the codification of the Gospels in the 2nd century, such that it makes very difficult, careful philological distinctions between the Gospels, because you can have harmonizing going on in those texts in the 2nd century. So, and I would grant that. My position, the Q plus Papias hypothesis, is a development of the 2-source hypothesis, but it differs dramatically insofar as Luke, in my view, is still the last of the synoptics, but prior to John. And but it has, in many cases, reversed priority to what you find in Matthew and Mark. Now, one could make an argument for that, as Trobisch and you are likely to, that shows harmonization in the 2nd century. And there are ways of, and Mark Goodacre attempts to show that, in fact, Luke is not necessarily earlier than Matthew, let's say, with the Beatitudes or the Lord's Prayer or that kind of thing. And we know these. We've been around the block on these things in Greek for a long time, so we're there. So one of the keys for me is this principle of reversed priority. That is, in some cases, though Matthew is later than Mark, it often, especially in the doublets and non-doublets, has more primitive material. Now that can come from oral tradition, and it can come from the 2nd century, where you have this harmonization going on among the Gospels. Nonetheless, I think you can say that these non-Markan doublets and non-doublets are more primitive. Then Luke, the same thing. You have reverse priority. Sometimes Luke's reading is more primitive than Matthew and Mark. So where does that come from? Well, the answer can again be oral tradition or multiple sources or harmonization in the 2nd century. So that's kind of where we get stuck. The Q plus Papias hypothesis emphasizes Papias very strongly. And I would insist, and you're likely to disagree, that the silence of Papias about Luke and John is very important, and that he talks about 2 Gospels of Matthew and 1 Gospel of Mark. The one Greek Gospel of Matthew is similar probably to what we have, but there's a lost Greek translation that he thinks is flawed, and he's going to put together his own harmonization in his exposition of Logia about the Lord. Now, I do think you're wrong, Marcus, about a couple of things that are relevant at this point. One is Papias does know of stories in the Synoptic Gospels. He knows of the death of Judas, for example. He also knows has his own account of the Last Supper. And he knows of characters who appear in the Synoptic Gospels with characteristics that we would identify with. So I really think Papias is exceedingly important in understanding it, both because there's a lost gospel. Luke talks about many other people who wrote diegesis of the expositions of things that happened among them. And I think he's aware I think he knows Papias. I think he knows Luke, Mark, and Matthew, and maybe a lost document by Aristion called, according to Papias, the expositions of the Logoi of the Lord. So that's the Q plus Papias hypothesis. And what I try to do, and I'm going to be touting my book, which you have not seen because it just came out recently, Synopses of Epic Tragedy and the Gospels, which in fact privileges my reconstruction of Q based on reverse priority. But the other key for me in solving the synoptic problem does not come from philology and comparison of the text that we've been talking about, but an expanded form of philology that includes mimesis, imitation of Greek poetry. And I think we've been playing with too few pieces of the puzzle on the table, and that we need to add some pieces of the puzzle, some of which come from the Hebrew Bible, but also others that would come from Greek poetry. And so I'm writing a sequel to this book that talks about the 2 keys to the synoptic problem. One is mimesis of Homer and Greek tragedy. And the other is getting Q right by by getting rid of, and I agree with you entirely, of the problem of the traditional Q hypothesis. It just does not work. And people who continue to defend it, I think, are not very imaginative about another way of reconstructing Q, because they're so committed to these two principles of Luke, Matthew independence and Q, Mark independence. The work that I've done on Marcion's Gospel is not nearly as extensive as what you and Matthias and Dieter wrote and Jason Badun have done. But I have done explorations about how Marcion's Gospel and the canonical Gospel of Luke variously treat narratives that I attribute to Homer. And in my view, the canonical gospel invariably is closer to the Homeric model than Marcion's gospel. And there are a number of places where the testimony, according to Dieter, wrote, but also to Jason, I think. By the way, Jason was one of my students. Dieter and I are good friends. We had breakfast the other day in Denver. David Trobish is a very good friend of mine, and I've hosted him here in Claremont, as I have with Matthias Klinghardt. So I know, I know the gang, and I'm glad to meet you. But many places in where we do not, where the testimony says the Marcion Gospel is lacking information, we have lots of Homeric and tragedian imitation. For example, the infancy narrative, so the triumphal entry story, or and I have a list of them. The parable of the wicked vine dressers, the lopping off of the ear of one of Judas's thugs, the baptism and temptation, the transfiguration story, and so on. So I'm struggling to see how I can be generous to Marcion's Gospel. By the way, let me stop and just say, the discovery of Marcion's Gospel is a treasure. I am not saying that the scholarship that's been done on Marcion's Gospel is shabby or irresponsible. Of course, Marcion scholars differ with each other on how extensive that gospel can be. So Matthias is much bigger than Dieter's, for example, and Jason's differs slightly from Dieter Roth's. And I haven't seen your reconstruction, but it probably is somewhere in the middle, or maybe more like Matthias's, perhaps, because of the Western text of Matthew. This gets very deep in the water, but to be generous to your hypothesis, I would have to say that if there is such Homeric imitation, it occurs at 2 or 3 different compositional moments. One would be already in Mark, because I still hold to Mark in priority. Another would be in the early development of the Lucan Gospel, that is what you would call Marcion's Gospel. And then the canonical expansion of that Gospel later. So that actually makes the problem of Homeric imitation even trickier, because you have multiple moments of composition where you have this. By the way, I found it fascinating that along the way, you made comments that I didn't anticipate you would make about, and it's probably because I don't know your work as well as I should, but I can't actually recall them. That it'll probably occur to me again. But I expected for us to disagree more than I agree with most of what you said about the problems in the synoptic problem. And sorry for the pun, it wasn't intentional, but the lack of clarity and the importance of this. Now, I'm not a theologian. In fact, I'm an atheist, so I'm not interested in the theological stuff. By the way, I would be also interested in this, because you're a patristic scholar, and I've done a lot of work in reconstructing texts of apocryphal Acts of Apostles, the Acts of Andrew in particular. Mm-hmm. The kind of philology that you and I are doing on the Gospels is not foreign to patristic scholars, because frequently we have, especially in apocryphal Acts of Apostles, various versions of things, often in different languages from different religious communities. And we know that they have some kind of a common source behind them. But in some cases, one is more faithful to the text than another. And sometimes one has to, go from language to language and do a diplomatic addition and just throw up your hands and say, something's behind this, but we still don't know what it is. I'm thinking of the ALAC group, Association pour la littérature chrétienne, that I was involved with. So just so Jacob, just so your viewers know that the kind of work we're doing is not a shell game. It's not a deviation, an attempt to deceive people. It's actually an attempt to use science to clarify what are the complex and fascinating interconnections of these texts.
Shall I reply?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. It's nice that you interweave with your own biography and the network of people you know and you have trained with the kind of scholarship you're doing. But before I start with that, also going back a bit into my biography, let me just repeat what you were saying. I mean, from the moment I was reading and preparing a bit for the talk today and the discussion we have, I have to admit, I discovered many more parallels and also overlaps between what you try to do and not only the problems to solve, but also the solutions you suggest. And what I like best is this interrelation between your views on mimesis and then tackling the problem of the synoptics. Again, coming from patristics, it's so clear that we are dealing with a tiny group of people in antiquity and late antiquity. We still haven't got an idea how many people were able to read. And then we know the people who write were not the most educated ones. Yeah, people who write were either paid for writing, but usually people who thought and had money didn't write, but rather spoke. So orality is important, yeah. And then sometimes people also started writing by their own hands for various reasons. But I think that the general view is like with Origen, you have people who write for you because you can speak quicker than you could write with your hands. And if you had money and patrons like Origen had, then you had several people who wrote down what you were saying and he was formulating his ideas. So that's rather the way it works. Now with our synoptics, it's different. You cannot simply memorize texts and weave them together if you just speak. Yeah. So homilies, yes, but textual studies. And again, I think Origen has not dictated his exegetical work on the Bible, so his hexapla, so his textual studies. That's stuff you need to write down, and you simply cannot because it
Right.
messes up all kinds of stuff. So we have to differentiate the mode in which people worked. But just to see the similarities. So coming from patristics, it's clear. Dealing with such a tiny group of people in antiquity. First of all, they knew each other, I think, certainly better than Dennis and me and Jacob were able to know each other via Zoom and the internet or whatever we have. So the world at the time was tinier than the tiny world today is. And still, I mention two names and Dennis says, oh, it's my student, or I had breakfast with him last week or a few days ago. Believe me, I cannot imagine that people in antiquity were different. They might not have had the same means, but we know the postal worked quite well. We have sometimes 2 or 3 deliveries of mail a day, just as in the late 19th century in Berlin, where Harnack replied twice a day to somebody who replied twice a day to his replies. So it wasn't very different from our email system, yeah. And in antiquity, we had a functioning Morse system for the military and a functioning postal service for the intellectuals. People also knew each other because they met each other. They were traveling, they were having the students who traveled, who got to know, like your student, I know. So people in antiquity knew the students of the other people. And
let me ask a question of you, kind of sideways on this conversation. I've been taken with social identity theory as it's been articulated, at least in the United States, by people like Hogan Abrams and Korston, Christina or something. And if one applies their criteria for assessing how in-groups and out-groups interrelate to each other and define each other, I find that it's when you apply that to the synoptic gospels, they're really, and the Gospel of John too, in fact, maybe particularly, you find very interesting, different social identity markers. So Matthew's world is distinct from Mark's world, is distinct from Luke's world. Now, they may have known each other, and of course, the pepet of many in the Greek world were a smaller unit than, widespread communities and global reach. But I really am impressed by the different sociological markers that we have. Even if we don't know who the authors are, I think we can say something about the audience.
For sure. And if I may interrupt, look, we both work in faculties. And if we took from the floor I was working on, 10 offices, the books of the 10 people who were produced by these 10 offices in, let's say, about 20 square meters of distance, you would have exactly this type of identity markers. So in each office sits its own social identity, who has relations to California, to Alaska, to South Africa, to Argentina, to Australia, totally different from mine.
Well, I don't think it's quite the same, Marcus, honestly. And I also think I would, to keep your model at work, what we find, you'd have to have your colleagues disagreeing with each other about their social identity markers too, because, the Gospels are in conversation with each other, sometimes polemically. So,
but that is exactly what we do today. Look, not that we have polemics between you and me, yeah, but isn't that exactly the same thing? I mean, we have social, we have identity markers, and despite and at the same time being in relation with each other, adapting, having different audiences. Yes.
I don't think the analogy works for me, but I think it's a clever response. Yeah.
But let me come back, because I hadn't finished this idea with the tiny group of intellectuals. I think what they have almost all in common is, and probably more than we had if you compare your schooling and my schooling, they had a very similar textbook basis. If they went beyond the primary education,
I agree.
and these people we are talking about, they had certainly some kind of a school of rhetoric, or certainly a higher,
right,
what we would call today a higher education.
Right.
Then it was based on very similar, I mean, on very few books.
It's exactly
that were based
right.
on those books on which you write. Homer was known by everybody.
Yeah.
I just had, because I've got a student at the moment who works on Paulus, who wrote this ekphrasis on the Hagia Sophia, which is, let's say, 80% an ekphrasis modeled on Nonnos and Homer. I've worked on the 4th century Apollinarius. Now, when the Greek tradition of Homer went or became more skeptically looked at, his father and him sat down and rewrote the entire Jewish and Christian Bible in Homeric verses.
Yes, that's
so
right.
that at least Homer is being preserved for Christians.
Yeah, that's right.
So we are moving from the 6th century to the 4th century. And if we move back to the 3rd century, we can take Cyprian. We can, in the 2nd century, we can take other people. Homer was simply the frame.
Yeah.
Just like Josephus had as his frame Homer. And so I think the books people all knew, were possibly in 10 roles.
That's right.
From the classical world. So nobody, I think, not a single person we are talking about in early Christianity had not Homer in his head and probably in his heart.
Yeah.
That's why I was not surprised at all. I was rather surprised that not many people have studied in detail, as you've done.
That's right. I'm surprised
the
too.
parallels between the canonic texts and Homer. I mean, some studies have been done before, but not as extensive as you are doing it.
Yeah.
Right. So I would love to see more. Just as I had the discussion with Joe Atkin a few days ago, Josephus was, as we can see from Eusebius, Josephus was another magisterial work for early Christians.
Let me give you. Thank you so much. I so appreciate the openness you have to the Homeric epics and so on, and Nonus of Panopolis rewriting the Gospel of John to make it Dionysian, and the Homeric Centones that you mentioned, the Byzantine intellectuals who rewrote the Gospels to make Homer accessible and so on. That has been overlooked in the history of interpretation, and I'm so glad your student is working on it. But there's one, if we had time to evaluate one text in Luke to see how this works, it would be the very ending of, and by the way, we haven't talked about where the Acts of the Apostles fits into all of this. That would be a different story, of course. Yeah. But at the very end of the Gospel of Luke, where you have the famous Emmaus story, Road to Emmaus, and the revelation of Jesus to 2 disciples, that appears extensively in both Marcion's Gospel and in the canonical Gospel. And for me, it becomes a kind of a test case in the comparison, and it would be really fascinating. In my synopses, I actually discuss it in some detail, because you have certain pieces in Marcion's Gospel where it apparently did not have content, We have lots of examples where we don't have any attestation one way or another. And again, I'm using Dieter Roth's taxonomy for this. And then in other places, we have textual variation, so we can compare them. Now, one of the things that's, this is one of the things, Marcus, I wanted to say about, I was surprised with that you said, which I agree with. I think Marcion could have inherited his gospel from someone else, but it is so congenial to his theology that I really think I would trust Tertullian on this question, that Marcion's the one who got rid of some of the Hebrew Bible elements. And you see it in the infancy narratives, but you also see it at the end of Luke, where there's a purging of references to Moses and the prophets. There's a purging of other pieces from the story where Luke is evoking the Jewish Bible. But it's missing, and it's so congenial to Marcion that I wouldn't be surprised that Marcion himself. Now, of course, that implies that there's something that Marcion had that was different from his gospel, which is not exactly your hypothesis. So, but anyway, that would be a wonderful text to look at sometime.
Look, my hypothesis, as I've said also to Jacob several times, is not a closed box. Yeah, it's work in progress. And until a few months ago, I think if you have the range between, as you just described it, between Dieter Roth, a rather Harnackian,
that's right,
Harnack adherent. If we then have the middle ground with Jason Bedouin, and let's say a more optimistic reconstruction by Matthias Klinghardt, I would have thought that I'm closer to Matthias's reconstruction than to the other two.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah.
But having said that, I have in the last 12 months studied the lexicography of the two versions, not just of the gospel compared to the canonical gospels, not just to Luke, but also to the other gospels, but also the version that we have from Paul, as we have it in Paul's letters, compared to what we know from Marcion's Paul. And although I'm not fully through, I'm still working on it, but I've done about 90% of the word check with the entire lexicography. So particularly looking like the FBI tries to make a difference from Twitter tweets, which are rather short, and identify the authors of these Twitter tweets to prosecute them. I have a bit more material, right? We have about 130,000 words in the New Testament, of which 5,000 different words, 130,000 in total, but roughly 5,000 different words, of which I've done almost 4,500 here. And the FBI says it's not important the big words, it is important the semantics, so the small words. The smaller and the more common, the more it gives a profile of an author. And it is utterly interesting that having done the study or doing the study, it turns out that it supports rather the idea of a canonical reduction of a pre-canonical text, whoever has written it, than a purging, or as you just said, and repeated what Tertullian was claiming, that Marcion was extracting or shortening.
No, that'll be valuable. I'll enjoy seeing that.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. It's work in progress. So I would I would be much more critical about Matthias's reconstructed parts, which have no witnesses. So I would be closer to the reconstruction of Dieter Roth in this respect.
Yeah.
To do with the wordings of the chapters, yeah. But the problem I have with Dieter Roth's or Harnack and Sons is that we only get a Swiss cheese, which has holes, which you cannot bite and cannot taste. So you get no idea of a text. But we certainly knew that the basis was not a Swiss cheese, but was a text. It was a gospel.
That's right. Exactly. That's exactly
a collection of letters.
And how to fill in those gaps is such a
exactly. So it needs some narrative material.
Yeah.
And but I would be more reluctant with knowing exactly how to fill those gaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I would. Yeah. I have one more, Jacob. If I could ask one more question. And then I'm going to have to go, I fear, fairly soon. Marcus, I'm surprised at the intransigence in the Guild of defenders of the two-document hypothesis. And in my experience, they really are so dogmatic about their methodology that it's hard to get a discussion going with them that's even-handed and is really evidential apart from the methodology they're committed to. So I would give papers and they would be ignored. I would go to a conference and no one would come to the presentation. And it feels to me that there's a bit of paranoia about defenders of the two-document hypothesis, or an intransigence to keep the synoptic problem open. Have you experienced any of that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember, a special issue of the ZAC, of the Journal of Antique Christianity, has been produced on Marcion, where I was explicitly disinvited to contribute, despite the fact that in the first footnote my name is mentioned as the opponent. Yeah,
I was to give a paper at a conference in Leuven, with Jasper Haydn and some company, and I had a challenge to the two-document hypothesis, showing that at the beginning of the hypothesis there were many people that thought there was a Q document, but also thought that Luke knew Matthew. And in fact, later on, it became dogma that Luke didn't know Matthew. So I was trying to say, well, at ad fontes, you have, a broader and a more generous understanding of Luke's possible knowledge of Matthew. They wouldn't publish the paper in the collected papers.
Oh yeah, I'm not surprised. But let me put a positive turn to that. Because we both know our colleagues. It's not bad will. It's not ignorance. It is,
it's not ignorance,
as I tried to explain when I was speaking before, it is, unfortunately, I think, part of the argument. If they give up that hard-nosed standing, yeah, and that's also why the two groups, the Goodacre Golder group versus the John Kloppenburg Q colleagues, right? Why they have difficulties to understand each other, because they both rely on fixed circularities, which if you break them off, you lose the grip.
They love the fight. They love the fight with each other too much to introduce,
and to be also fair, it produces an amount of material which is funded by big funding organizations that produces books. So there is an industry behind, yeah.
That's right. Yeah,
invested interest in getting that going. Yeah. So why not?
Yeah.
But I don't fear much about it, because I think there are enough channels where we can discuss it, and still I think all of us, irrespective of hypothesis, all of us are trying at least to work towards a better understanding. And unfortunately, as you need to leave, I haven't answered an important question that you asked me. And that is the core of one of your theories on Papias.
Oh, no, go ahead. No, please.
But I think it will take a bit of time. And I was wondering, Jacob, whether we shouldn't have another session at some point where we take as a central topic Papias and his role in the synoptics, and also in his role in the Marcionite theory, because I was surprised when I was talking not long ago to a New Testament scholar who was writing a commentary on John, that he said to me that he had never come across, or at least he didn't remember, the Papias text about John.
Yeah.
Apparently very little people know about it, but it is a very important text, not only because it gives us a hint to the dating of Papias, but also the locating of the discussion about
But
synoptics. Having said that,
I'd like to piggyback on that just briefly. I think Papias was a Johannine Christian.
Yeah, that's what he says.
Yeah, and because he must know the Apocalypse of John, probably in an earlier version of it. He says he knows the elder John. He cites him on various points, and there are other places where you have more Johannine influence. The fact that he's the bishop of Hierapolis and knows nothing about the Apostle Paul is really very interesting to me. Whether he is a Johannine Christian or that's the kind of Christian umwelt that he knows and lives in, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure what one can know. But if there is a branch of the Christian movement that it would be most congenial to Papias, it's the Johannine tradition.
Yeah. You know, to finish probably this one here with a biographical note, when I was a graduate student, I wrote my graduate dissertation in 1984. It was published. So the very, very first work I did was a commentated bibliography on Papias.
Is that right?
That was part of the work which was published under the name of Josef Kürzinger, who was
is that right? Yeah.
Yes, he was the old New Testament scholar.
Yeah.
And Reinhard Hübner, my own supervisor, did a critical edition of the fragments of Papias, because also at that time the Armenian fragments had been published.
That's right. Yeah.
By Volker Siegert,
yeah,
which were then included
in one of my books. Yeah.
So this was the beginning. So Papias goes with me all my life.
Great.
But I think it would need a bit more development for.
No, that's fine. Thanks for getting us together. I hope we can get together again.
Yeah, I would love to organize a part 2 to this. Papias, Marcion of the Synoptics would be a great title for that show.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's figure it out.
In the new year. Yeah.
After the new year, sure. But yeah, let's figure out a date.
Well, Marcus, I have another question for you as we end. How could you have the name Marcus and not believe in Mark in priority?
I tell you why.
Yeah?
I think Marcus and the names that you have, of course, you should always be a bit critical and self-critical.
Of course, yeah.
So Marcion, actually, just linguistically, is the diminutive form of Mark. So I think by self-admission, he thinks probably of himself as being a small Mark. So Tertullian might have picked on that and thought, oh yeah, he cut him short. Yeah.
Thanks again, Jacob.
Oh, thank you. I thank both of you for joining me today. This has been a fun discussion to listen to.
Yeah, Marcus, it's a pleasure to meet you. Yeah.
Likewise.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.